Sometime in the morning, when shadows are deep, I lie here beside you, watching you sleep. Sometimes I whisper, but I'm thinking of my cup runneth over with love. Sometimes in the evening, when you do not see, I study the small things that you do constantly, and I memorize moments that I'm fondest of. My cup runneth over with love.
Let's get going. So, I have entitled this On the Other Side, The Journey on the Quest for Birth Equity. If you go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Uh-oh. Can you hear? Can you move my next slide? Okay, if you can't move the next slide, okay. This is a March of Dimes report card, which they give out every year. And it's a report card of prematurity. And Black babies are twice as likely to die before their first birthday. And one of the major causes for them dying before their first birthday is because they're born premature. So they're born 7 months, so many weeks early. They're too small, too little, too small, and too early. And so our babies don't make it as well as other babies. Now, let me say this from the very beginning. Most of our babies do fine. Most of our mothers do fine. But we can't afford to lose not one mother, not one baby. And so when we have our babies dying at high rates, it's really wrong. This March of Dimes report card really is an indication of those places where we have the highest rates of prematurity. And as I'm sad to say, the South is still at the top of the game. If all of those in red are where you have the highest rates of prematurity. Then from red you go to yellow, which is the second highest rate. Which so the reds get a letter grade of F. In other words, they have just absolutely failed. Then you go to the yellows, and the yellow are C, so they're better. And then the blue is better still, and here's purple. And look, only one state has purple, where the babies are really, the prematurity rate is as we would hope it would be. Next slide, please. Now, we've been looking at the prematurity for some time, but recently we've been looking at something that we did not expect to happen. Can you, in 2020, we have women who are hemorrhaging and dying as a result of childbirth. With all the technology, with all the medicine, with all the advances that we make, we still have women who are dying. Now, we did not have this before, but it's almost as if it creeped up. We weren't paying a lot of attention to it. Now we look like less developed countries in the world in terms of maternal mortality. And the rates are particularly high for Black women and Native American women, as this chart will indicate. So what's going on? Next slide, please. So as you'll see in the next slide, there's something going on that we don't expect in terms of maternal mortality. And there's something going on in terms of infant mortality that we don't expect. And so this is a recent CDC report that says that college-educated women or higher at 1.6 times that of white women with less than a high school diploma. And women with college education or higher have greater rates of maternal mortality than for Black women, 5.2 times that of their white counterparts. What's the essence of this? The essence of it is that for well-educated women, we have higher rates of dying as a result of pregnancy complications. And it's not only for our counterparts, but for women who have only a high school diploma. Something desperately wrong. Next slide, please. So when we have this, so what we found is not only does this happen for maternal mortality, but it also happens in terms of infant mortality. I'll share this with everybody, with Dr. Cole as well. In the late 1980s, I received a survey that was passed out through our Alumni Association, which was asking us to talk about our pregnancy experiences. And the rationale that was being given for this survey was that there was something, there was a disparity in terms of birth outcomes for African American and white women. Well, I was insulted by the survey. I thought, okay, now you say our children can't learn and we're inferior about this, and now you're going to say we can't have babies. So I didn't fill out the survey. I got the survey a second time. Well, the survey was being administered to women and graduates of colleges in the AU Center, and most specifically Spelman College, and graduates from Agnes Scott, which is a predominantly white school. This is in the late 80s, and at that time, Agnes Scott was predominantly white, and Spelman was predominantly Black. Well, little did I know, by the 1980s, the early 1990s, they published a study, this very study that I decided I was not going to participate in. And another study was published as well. And what they found that well-educated African-American women had worse birth outcomes than their college-educated white counterparts, and that their birth outcomes were worse than white women who merely had a high school diploma. So here we have this was really a forecast of what we've seen in terms of maternal deaths. So it doesn't matter what kind of education we have. It doesn't matter what resources that we have. It doesn't matter what information that we have. We are at risk of having babies born too soon, too early, or having complications during pregnancy that can either lead to death or long-term health consequences. Next slide, please. So why is this? Why is this? So the first thing people will say, well, healthcare inequity, and that is absolutely true. Not just during pregnancy and birth, but before. We know that we do not get the same kinds of services, we do not get the same kinds of medications, we do not get the same kind of information, and so forth and so on. So there are real issues in terms of health equity. Inaccessible health care. In Washington, D.C., there are what we call birthplace deaths, where women just have no place to go where they're going to have, if they're pregnant and going to have babies. So those are issues. Culturally incompetent care. Care that does not address, does not respond to us, does not understand, does not integrate those lived experiences that we have as risk, as well as assets for us becoming healthy. Poverty. Poverty. So as I talk about well-educated women, it does not dismiss the fact that poverty is a major risk to health outcomes. Epigenetics. So when I mean epigenetics, what is the environment and the genetics? We know, for instance, that high levels of discrimination affect the telomere length, which is part of genetic material. And when those are shortened, it is related to shorter lifespan. So we know that something that's always attacking us can affect not only the way we live, but how long we live. And environmental factors, and I'm dealing with environmental justice as well as the social and the physical. So those are the things that really are contributors to the worst birth outcomes that African American women have. But go for next one. But as Ella Baker would say, oppressed people, whatever the level of formal education, have the ability to understand and interpret the world around them, to see the world for what it is and to transform it. This has been the basis of the research that I've done these many years. I've always believed and continue to believe that the solutions to these problems and the explanations to why we're here in the first place lie in the voices and the lived experiences of African American women. This is my anthropological training, Dr. Cole. This is what I learned, but I also learned the psychology training in terms of how you measure. And so it's been the combination of the two that have brought me to the point in terms of the work that I do. But I start out with what Ella Baker says, that we, whatever the level of formal education that we have the ability to understand and interpret the world and come up with solutions. Next slide, please. So, talking to women over these many years, Black women from all walks of life, across the lifespan, I may say, women who I've talked to in the course of doing this research range from 17 to 80 something. So I've talked to Black women from all walks of life, from all stages of life. And ultimately, after they recognize that there's something wrong with the health care that they're receiving, after they understand that maybe we need to eat better and do more exercise, after they understand that there are other things that are going on, they acknowledge that stress is a major health crisis for us. Stress. And so stress, from an evolutionary standpoint, is a threat to survival. But stress can be good in that sense because as we push back, as we fight against, it moves us to another level. But from a day-to-day standpoint, stress is an impediment, and response to those impediments and impediments to our goals and expectations. What do we want in our lives? And that can be as little as trying to get from point A to point B, and there are things that keep you from going there, like the traffic or what have you, or change in the route, to major things of where am I going to live, how am I going to live there, and so forth. We talk about stress as being acute and chronic and traumatic, and we're all talking about traumatic stress now in the times that we live in. Acute stress are those kind of things that kind of jolt us from us going along. But and chronic stress are those things that happen day to day. But we draw these lines, but really they're not hard and fast. In fact, we have border crossing in terms of acute and chronic and traumatic stress, and we really are seeing that now. When we have stress, there are physiological and emotional responses. So we know that there are biological processes that start from the amygdala and cause us to have cortisol levels and other levels that are higher. And if they don't come down, they cause sickness. And if they don't come down, they lead to disease. And if they don't come down, they're contributors to death. So unabated stress, it compromises our immune systems, our vascular systems, and of course affects our psychosocial responses. Next slide. Now, we talk about stress not only in terms of what the exposure is, but our response to it. And we used in the kind of those people, stressologists, would talk about the fight or flight notion that you confront a stressor and you either fight it or you run away from it. Now, from a more feminist standpoint, there are those who would say that a woman's response may look like tend and befriend, that we may, in our nurturing kind of way, capacity, that we may get into that way of dealing. But the point is that stress is both the exposure and the way that we adapt to it. And when there's this maladaptation, we have problems. So we talk about that as allostatic load. Research has looked at what they call manifestations of allostatic load in terms of blood pressure levels, cardiovascular response, some of the physiological that you can measure in the blood, that Black women bear a larger burden of allostatic load than Black men and white women. And it's more pronounced for non-poor Black women as compared to poor white women. So here we are with class doesn't protect us. Education doesn't protect us. There are things that are going on that really put us at risk. Next slide, please. So when we have stress, constant stress over a period of time, as I said, it affects those systems. But when it affects the systems, it can lead to hypertension, cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, and poor birth outcomes. And it also affects our mood, our issues of depression and anxiety and so forth. And so it's no wonder that when we look at the disparity research data, we see that we unfortunately have the high rates of hypertension, the high rates of cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes. And the interesting thing about hypertension, looking at the data that looks at young people, uh, adolescents going up to about 20 years of age, you begin to see this disparity between black and white in those 17 to 19-year-old black women. You see indications of pre-diabetes. You see indications of hypertension. You see it early on. And so by the time they hit 20s, you begin to see this wide schism between black and white women around those very conditions. So something is really going on. Next slide, please. So if we have these persistent, and how does it impact pregnancy? Well, in pregnancy, it suppresses the immune system, which can lead to infections, which also then can lead to premature birth. And it also increases the cortisol levels, which also means that it can stunt the growth that leads to low birth weight. And it also has implications for reducing the blood flow. So there's some very specific ways that stress impacts pregnancy. Now, where does our stress come from? And I've led up to this as I've talked about where the things that we think, because we have education, because we have resources, because we have information, because we have supposed access to birth to good medical care. But what we have, next slide please, is racism, pure and simple. It is with good reasons that several health districts in the country, including DeKalb County, have declared racism as a public health risk. Not beat around the bush, just straight to the corner. Milwaukee was the first city in the United States to declare it as such, and it's based on a real a large body of scientific evidence to that point. Early on, researchers like Clark and Anderson and Clark and Williams saw that racism was a stressor for African Americans, looking at those physiological responses. So we know that when you do studies in laboratories where individuals will see, for instance, police files or what have you, we know blood pressure rises. We know that galvanic skin responses changes. We know that there are certain physiological things that happen. And we see differences between black men and women. And so the women are more likely to hold those physiological responses longer than men, and therefore putting us at greater risk. Next slide, please. So, but it's not just race, it's gender too. It's gender too. And here I call upon those sisters, Patricia Hill Collins, Philomena said, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who have talked about the intersection, the multiplicative effects of race, gender, and class when they coincide together. And so it's not what we experience as blacks, but what we experience as women as well. And that has to do with the roles and responsibilities we have, and having to do added duty, having to do that much more, and whatever it is, because of our race and our gender, and not in the same way that our white counterparts have to do this. Next slide, please. So, what do women say? Going back to Ella Baker, you ask women what it is. What do women say? Well, women say that under-resourced communities, discrimination in the workplace, financial obligations, financial burdens, nurture overload, abuse and neglect, toxic relationships, racism and sexism, and care and protection of children. Next slide, please. You can still hear me? Can you still hear? Okay, good. If you can still hear me. So, this one about protection of children. Well, I'll get to that. So, looking at all those things that I just told you that women have talked about, I call this contextualized stress. The way we measure stress is more in the psychological domain arena. Is more generalizable stress. But I want to think about contextualized stress. Stress that is comes from the places where we live and work and go about our lives, and stress that is shaped by our identities as Black, gender, sexuality, age, all of those things provide a context for the stresses that we experience. And so my colleagues and I have published these papers, and what the two that are cited here deals with contextualized stress and depression in well-educated women. And what we found is that as their contextualized stress, as they had these exposures to the things that I mentioned, and not as much of the support that they needed, as that went up, as stress went up, so did their levels of depression. The second study, we found out that it really didn't matter whether they started out middle class or they started out lower class and then had upward mobility, that you still saw this strong relationship between that contextualized stress and depression during pregnancy. Now, I know everybody in this call knows what the dangers are of depression during pregnancy. The dangers of is really a woman cannot function if she's depressed during pregnancy. And it puts her at higher risk for postpartum depression, which means now she can no longer take care of herself or her baby, which means that baby is at risk of failure to thrive and so forth. So it's a very serious matter when we have women who are depressed during pregnancy. Next slide, please. So, care and protection of children, police violence. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote an op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about George Floyd, and we all heard him cry out for his mother, cry out for his mother as his life was being snuffed out. And so, what did that mean? What that meant to me was both what was his mother in his life and who was his mother for her own life, because they both were at risk. And so the researchers started to look at what is police violence doing to pregnant women. What are we thinking when we carry a life in our womb? And what is the prospect for that child? The first study by Bohr and others, what they did, they looked not so much at pregnancy, but they looked at what were the numbers of mental health days that were taken after a police episode. And not surprising, African Americans had to take more days off after there was police episodes of police violence, and had to take them off months after it happened. In Baltimore, after the Baltimore episode, the Baltimore riots that took place, we saw that pregnant women in that city showed an uptick in terms of signs of depression. They eventually went down, but this meant that this was really affecting them. In Atlanta, Georgia, my colleagues and I looked at negative police encounters, not that they had happened, but they had anticipated. We asked a question like, I'm paraphrasing, is my children more likely to have negative encounters? My children's youth are more likely to have negative encounters with the police. And for those women who responded yes to that, they were more apt to have signs of depression during pregnancy. Now, this was a couple of years in Clayton County before we had the cases the episodes that we had here in the city. That said that wherever it's happening, we're thinking about it. And pregnant women are thinking about this as they plan to give birth to a Black child. Next slide, please. So here we are, George Floyd and coronavirus. Trauma, trauma, trauma. Everybody's in the trauma. And what do we do now? And this is trauma on top of the ongoing experiences of racism and sexism that women have experienced, Black women experience now. All these other studies that I've shown to you are things that have happened. They're past studies. At this moment, we now have this uh, on top of the existing experiences that are happening, that have happened in our community. Next slide, please. So what do we do? Well, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've spent most of my day looking at the homegoing of John Lewis. So we got to get in some good trouble, and we got to really get in good trouble now. And we have to start out to think about what is it that we believe in. Now, I believe first and foremost that health is a human right, that everybody should have it, that health is a human right, and we should expect health and quality, accessible, and affordable health care for everyone, supported by equitable conditions across all sectors representing the social determinants of health. That means we've got to have good education. There's no doubt about it. Now, how we do that, I don't know, but there's smart people in this country who have figured out. Transportation. When you have deserts where women cannot get good health care, part of it is they can't get there, and they can't get there because the transportation is not there for them. Housing. We are in a housing crisis. We are in a housing crisis. I heard someone today talk about a bill that was passed in the 1960s, which gave churches and nonprofits the means to build affordable housing. We've got to have affordable housing. We've got to have employment and fair and decent wages. To fight over the $600 now that's being taken away is unconscionable. Now people know that there's better, and they will fight for better. And so we have to have all of those things, because those things which are part of the social determinants, along with healthcare, will help us to improve the outcomes in the birth and maternal outcomes that we now witnessing. Next slide, please. And there we are on the streets. I wish I could go on there. I can't get there. But that's all right. We need to support this generation. I tell them, I said, I can get on the phone and I have a few dollars for you too. So we must continue the fight. It was just really something to hear the speakers today who talked about the things that had happened with John Lewis and what happened in Nashville and the laws and the bills that were passed. And I'm hopeful because I see things that are happening. I was on a call the other day for the Black Mama Maternal Health Caucus, which is putting forth major legislation to support the health care for Black mamas and to support the advancing and expanding the health workers in all regards. So I am hopeful. Next slide, please. Turning to the voices of women, some years ago, I had a project where I asked women who lived in one of the public housing areas, part of the Healthy Start, really the Dunbar Center area. And I asked the women to take these cameras and go out and take pictures, capturing a day in their lives. But there was one caveat. I asked them to journal about it and to tell me something that was an asset, not what was wrong, but what they had to bring to the table. What would they do? What did they have? So I got this picture and I said, okay, it's a pantry, no food to speak of there. What is it? So then I read the journal article and the journal entry, and the woman said, you know, my mama lives down the street and we eat with her every day. Well, there was obviously there's something very good in that. But had I seen just the first side of it, I would have thought, oh my goodness, they're starving. But on the other side, there was something else that was going on that could have been missed, that really could have missed. So we have to listen to the voices of African American women, and we have to interrogate the assets that we have, because we're always talking about what we don't have and what we can't get and what's going on, but there are assets in our community that we're not fully tapping on. Next slide, please. So I'm going to come to the end now, and in this meeting where I did photo voice, and that picture that I just showed you, there were other people who looked at the pictures, and they gave the negative interpretation, and then the women gave their asset interpretation of what was going on. And so I gathered this I used this to kind of start an umbrella around what I call Save 100 Babies and mothers too, really. So we have to have healthy families. We have to have enduring faith. We have to believe that there's more. And in this time, more than ever, we have to believe that there's more. We have to have positive social support and advance that. I am really excited in some ways when I go on online now at all the things that are happening in terms of how we take care of ourselves in this moment. And I'm seeing some of the most innovative kinds of things about exercise, about talk groups, about just all kinds of things that even at this time, which is a down or shift, is more than a down. But we have to create and develop and advance those positive support systems, safe and affordable housing. We have to have healthy nutrition and quality education, fair employment and livable wages, accessible transportation, and quality health care. As I close, I've been thinking about this book that I read many years ago. I think the author's Fulcrum. He said, "It's all I learned." I'm paraphrasing. Everything I needed for life, I learned in kindergarten, something to that effect. And I started on my career. My first job was as a preschool teacher. And so, for those of you who've had that experience, with the little ones, if you're taking them somewhere, you have them to hold hands. And so Fulcrum said, remember always, hold hands. And we have to hold hands now. Look both ways. And we have to look all kinds of ways with all kinds of eyes to see what we're doing. And keep your eyes on the direction where you're supposed to go. I thank you, my sisters, and let's save mothers and babies.
My cup, I thank you, runneth over with love.